In the early 1970s, America found itself in the middle of a strange and restless moment, one that felt less like a single revolution and more like a long, grinding cultural earthquake. The ground had already been shaking for years, but by the start of the decade, the tremors were impossible to ignore. Old assumptions about authority, patriotism, race, gender, art, and truth itself were cracking open, and what emerged from those cracks would permanently reshape how Americans saw themselves and their country. To understand why the 1970s felt so volatile, it helps to rewind slightly to the late 1960s, when optimism and outrage existed side by side. The civil rights movement had forced legal change, but not moral closure. The Vietnam War had dragged on far longer than promised, draining faith in government and exposing a widening gap between official statements and lived reality. Assassinations had cut down leaders who seemed to offer moral clarity, leaving behind shock, grief, and a sense that history itself had lost its balance. By the time the new decade arrived, millions of Americans, especially the young, no longer trusted the institutions that claimed to speak for them. This distrust became one of the defining emotions of the era. It crept into politics, into classrooms, into living rooms, and into the art people consumed. Books questioned national myths. Films abandoned heroic certainty in favor of ambiguity and disillusionment. Music turned raw and confessional. Even comedy grew sharper, more cynical, less interested in comforting audiences than in provoking them. Culture was no longer merely entertainment. It was a battleground where Americans argued over what the country had been, what it was becoming, and whether it could still be redeemed. Universities were among the first places where these arguments erupted into open conflict. College campuses in the early 1970s were charged environments, filled with young people who had grown up watching televised war and state violence. Many had marched against the draft or faced it directly. When the National Guard killed 4 students at Kent State University in 1970, the event sent a shockwave across the nation. It confirmed the fears of many that the state was willing to use deadly force against its own citizens to maintain control. The line between foreign war and domestic unrest suddenly felt dangerously thin. The consequences of this moment went far beyond protests. A generation began to question whether the American promise, the idea that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded by fairness and freedom, was fundamentally flawed. This skepticism found expression in literature that rejected simple narratives of progress. Novelists and journalists turned toward fragmented storytelling, unreliable narrators, and moral gray zones. Truth, once assumed to be discoverable and shared, now seemed slippery, subjective, and contested. Nowhere was this shift more visible than in the movies of the decade. The old studio system, which had once produced clear heroes and tidy endings, was losing its grip. In its place emerged filmmakers willing to explore corruption, paranoia, and moral compromise. Stories no longer reassured audiences that institutions would ultimately do the right thing. Instead, they suggested that power often protected itself at the expense of ordinary people. These films did not merely reflect public cynicism, they intensified it, giving visual form to fears that had previously been whispered or denied. Politics, too, underwent a dramatic transformation. The presidency, once treated with near reverence, became an object of suspicion. The Watergate scandal, unfolding through the early 1970s, exposed illegal actions and systematic deception at the highest levels of government. When President Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, it marked the first time an American president had been forced from office. For many, this confirmed the worst suspicions of the era. The problem was not a single bad actor, but a system that encouraged secrecy and abuse of power. The cultural impact of Watergate cannot be overstated. It taught Americans to read between the lines, to doubt official narratives, and to assume that hidden motives lurked behind public statements. Journalists were elevated to heroic status, while politicians became objects of satire and distrust. Late-night comedy and editorial cartoons flourished, feeding on the idea that authority deserved ridicule rather than respect. This shift permanently altered the relationship between citizens and their leaders. At the same time, movements that had begun in the previous decade gained new urgency and complexity. Feminism entered a new phase, challenging not only legal inequalities but deeply ingrained cultural norms. Women demanded control over their bodies, their labor, and their representation in media. These demands provoked fierce backlash, revealing how threatening many found the idea of changing gender roles. The struggle played out in courtrooms, workplaces, and popular culture, where images of women oscillated between liberation and exploitation. The fight for racial justice also entered a more complicated stage. Legal segregation had been dismantled, but economic inequality and systemic racism remained entrenched. Urban unrest, rising incarceration rates, and battles over school desegregation revealed the limits of earlier victories. Cultural expression became one of the most powerful tools for articulating this frustration. Music, film, and literature created by Black artists offered unfiltered accounts of life in America's cities, challenging audiences to confront realities often ignored by mainstream media. As these debates intensified, many Americans sought escape from politics altogether. This impulse shaped the decade in surprising ways. The rise of blockbuster entertainment in the mid to late 1970s offered audiences relief from relentless anxiety. Films with clear heroes, spectacular visuals, and hopeful endings signaled a shift away from the grim realism of earlier years. Yet even this turn toward escapism was shaped by the cultural revolution that preceded it. The desire for comfort was itself a response to exhaustion, a sign of how deeply the earlier conflicts had cut. Religion and spirituality also underwent transformation during this period. Traditional religious institutions struggled to maintain authority, while alternative spiritual movements gained popularity. Some people turned inward, seeking personal enlightenment rather than collective political change. This focus on self-discovery, therapy, and personal growth became a hallmark of the era, influencing everything from psychology to advertising. Critics argued that it represented a retreat from social responsibility, while supporters saw it as a necessary rebalancing after years of upheaval. The economy added another layer of instability. Inflation, unemployment, and energy crises undermined the post-war promise of endless growth. The oil shocks of the 1970s forced Americans to confront their dependence on global systems beyond their control. Gas lines, rationing, and rising prices made abstract geopolitical tensions painfully tangible. Economic insecurity fueled resentment and fear, emotions that cultural and political movements both reflected and exploited. Books of the decade captured this sense of uncertainty with remarkable precision. Non-fiction works exposed corporate misconduct, government secrecy, and environmental degradation. Fiction explored alienation, identity, and the fragility of human connection in an increasingly bureaucratic world. Readers were drawn to stories that acknowledged their doubts rather than dismissing them. The act of reading itself became a way to process collective anxiety, to find language for feelings that seemed otherwise inexpressible. By the late 1970s, the Cultural Revolution had not resolved America's contradictions, but it had permanently altered the terrain on which they would be fought. Trust in institutions remained low. Media had become more fragmented and confrontational. Politics grew more polarized as different groups interpreted the lessons of the decade in radically different ways. Some concluded that government power needed strict limits. Others argued that only strong collective action could address systemic injustice. What united these responses was a shared recognition that the old narratives no longer held. The idea of America as an uncomplicated force for good, guided by wise leaders and shared values, had been irreversibly challenged. In its place emerged a more contested, self-critical vision of the nation. This vision was uncomfortable, often painful, but also deeply influential. It shaped how future generations would talk about power, identity, and responsibility. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not announce itself with a single manifesto or defining moment. It unfolded through arguments, scandals, songs, novels, and films, through everyday conversations and private doubts. It was messy, contradictory, and incomplete, yet its impact can still be felt in modern debates about truth, authority, and freedom. The questions raised during that decade never truly went away. They simply changed form, waiting for new generations to confront them again. As the decade moved forward, the consequences of this upheaval began to settle into daily life, not as resolution, but as a new normal. Americans woke up each morning in a country that felt less certain of itself than it had a generation earlier. The confidence that had defined the post-war years, the sense that history bent naturally toward prosperity and moral clarity, had eroded. In its place was a quieter, more anxious awareness that progress could stall, reverse, or come at an unbearable cost. This shift was especially visible in how Americans talked about power. Power was no longer imagined simply as something held by presidents or generals. It was understood as something embedded in systems, in corporations, in media narratives, and in social norms so deeply ingrained they often went unnoticed. This realization didn't make people feel empowered so much as exposed. If power was everywhere, then resisting it required constant vigilance, and that vigilance was exhausting. The press played a crucial role in shaping this new awareness. Investigative journalism flourished, driven by reporters who believed that secrecy itself was a form of corruption. Newspapers and magazines competed to uncover hidden truths, and readers devoured these revelations with a mix of outrage and grim satisfaction. Each exposé confirmed what many already suspected, that the official version of events was rarely the whole story. At the same time, this constant stream of scandal created a lingering sense of unease. If deception was routine, then certainty became impossible. Television amplified these dynamics. It brought images of war, protest, and political downfall directly into American homes, collapsing the distance between public events and private life. Families watched hearings, speeches, and confrontations unfold in real time, forming opinions not just from written accounts, but from tone of voice, facial expressions, and awkward silences. Television made politics feel intimate and invasive, reinforcing the idea that nothing and no one was beyond scrutiny. This scrutiny extended to American history itself. Scholars, activists, and artists revisited familiar stories and asked uncomfortable questions about who had been excluded or silenced. Textbooks were challenged, monuments were debated, national holidays were re-examined. The past was no longer treated as a settled narrative, but as a contested space shaped by perspective and power. For some, this felt like an attack on national identity. For others, it was a long overdue reckoning. Young people growing up in the 1970s inherited this atmosphere of questioning. They were less likely to assume that institutions deserved loyalty by default. Careers were approached with caution, marriage with skepticism, and patriotism with irony. This did not mean they were apathetic. On the contrary, many cared deeply about justice, equality, and authenticity. But they were wary of grand promises and suspicious of movements that claimed to offer simple solutions. The workplace reflected these changing attitudes. Traditional corporate hierarchies were increasingly criticized as dehumanizing and exploitative. Workers demanded more say in their conditions, more flexibility, and more meaning. While these demands were not always met, they influenced management styles and labor conversations for decades to come. The idea that work should provide not just income, but fulfillment gained traction, even as economic realities made that ideal difficult to achieve. Art of the era captured this tension between idealism and disillusionment with striking honesty. Songwriters wrote lyrics that felt like confessions, revealing vulnerability rather than bravado. Novelists lingered on inner lives, exploring anxiety, alienation, and moral ambiguity. Visual artists experimented with forms that rejected polish and permanence, embracing fragmentation and impermanence instead. These creative choices mirrored a society unsure of what deserved reverence and what needed dismantling. At the same time, backlash grew. Not everyone welcomed this constant questioning. Many Americans longed for a return to order, clarity, and pride. They saw the cultural shifts of the 1970s as corrosive, undermining values that had once provided stability. This reaction was not merely emotional, it was political. Calls for law and order, for traditional family structures, and for renewed national strength gained momentum as the decade wore on. These competing impulses coexisted uneasily. The same society that questioned authority also yearned for reassurance. The same culture that celebrated authenticity also feared fragmentation. This contradiction was not resolved in the 1970s, but it defined the choices Americans would make in the years ahead. The debates of the decade laid the groundwork for future realignments, shaping how political movements framed their messages and how voters responded to them. By the end of the decade, the language of revolution had faded, but its effects remained embedded in everyday assumptions. Americans were more comfortable with dissent, more alert to injustice, and more cynical about power. They were also more divided, less certain of shared truths, and more vulnerable to fear-driven narratives. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s had not destroyed American identity, but it had stripped away illusions that once held it together. What emerged was a nation forced to live with complexity. Simple stories no longer sufficed. Heroes were flawed, victories partial, and progress uneven. This recognition was painful, but it also opened space for deeper honesty. The willingness to confront uncomfortable realities became one of the era's most enduring legacies, shaping how Americans would face future crises. The 1970s did not offer closure. Instead, they handed the country a set of unresolved questions about power, responsibility, and belonging. Those questions would resurface again and again in new forms and new contexts, carried forward by the cultural currents set in motion during that turbulent decade. As the country edged toward the end of the decade, these unresolved questions began to harden into habits of thought. Doubt was no longer a temporary reaction to crisis, it had become a default posture. Americans learned to assume that official explanations were incomplete, that motives were mixed, and that power rarely operated in the open. This did not necessarily make the public wiser or more just, but it did make them more alert, more attuned to contradictions, and more likely to challenge what they were told. One of the most lasting changes of the era was how Americans understood freedom. In earlier generations, freedom had often been framed as collective, tied to national destiny or shared prosperity. In the 1970s, it increasingly became personal. Freedom meant autonomy, self-expression, and the right to define one's own identity. This shift reshaped debates about sexuality, family, religion, and lifestyle. Choices once considered deviant or marginal were claimed as expressions of individual liberty, forcing society to reconsider where tolerance ended and responsibility began. This redefinition of freedom was both liberating and destabilizing. On one hand, it allowed people to live more honestly, to reject roles that felt imposed rather than chosen. On the other, it weakened shared expectations and social bonds. Critics argued that an emphasis on personal fulfillment encouraged narcissism and disengagement from civic life. Supporters countered that authentic participation was impossible without self-determination. The tension between these views became a defining feature of modern American culture. Education reflected this struggle as well. Classrooms became sites of debate over whose knowledge mattered and whose experiences counted as legitimate. Students questioned curricula that centered narrow perspectives, while educators experimented with new approaches to teaching history and literature. These efforts were uneven and controversial, but they signaled a broader willingness to rethink inherited frameworks. Learning was no longer simply about absorbing facts. It was about interpreting meaning and confronting bias. Even science and expertise, once regarded as neutral authorities, were pulled into this atmosphere of skepticism. Environmental disasters, medical scandals, and technological failures eroded blind faith in progress. The environmental movement gained momentum as people recognized that industrial growth carried hidden costs. Pollution, resource depletion, and ecological imbalance were no longer abstract concerns but visible threats. The idea that humanity could dominate nature without consequence was increasingly questioned. The energy crisis crystallized many of these anxieties. It revealed how fragile modern life was, how dependent it had become on complex global systems. Suddenly, everyday routines were disrupted by forces beyond individual control. This sense of vulnerability challenged the belief that technological advancement guaranteed security. It also exposed inequalities, as some communities bore the brunt of shortages and price increases, while others remained insulated. Popular culture absorbed and reflected these fears in subtle ways. Stories became darker, more introspective, more preoccupied with survival than triumph. Even when narratives offered hope, it was often cautious and conditional. Audiences learned to expect ambiguity, to accept that not all conflicts would be resolved neatly. This shift trained viewers and readers to tolerate uncertainty, a skill that would prove necessary in the decades to come. Yet the 1970s were not solely defined by anxiety and loss. They were also a period of experimentation and creativity, fueled by the belief that old constraints could be shed. New forms of community emerged, some fleeting, others enduring. Alternative lifestyles, cooperative ventures, and grassroots activism flourished in pockets across the country. While many of these experiments failed or faded, they expanded the range of possibilities Americans could imagine. By the time the decade drew to a close, the Cultural Revolution had reshaped the emotional landscape of the nation. Americans were less naive, but also less unified. They carried a deeper awareness of injustice and a heavier burden of uncertainty. The stories they told themselves about who they were and where they were going had become more complex, more contested, and more honest. These changes did not remain confined to the 1970s. They flowed directly into the political and cultural battles of the 1980s and beyond. Arguments over truth, authority, and identity, first sharpened during this era, became permanent features of American life. The Cultural Revolution did not end so much as it evolved, its questions echoing long after the decade itself had passed. And in that sense, the 1970s were not a detour from American history, but a turning point. They forced the nation to confront its contradictions without the comfort of easy answers. They taught Americans how to live with doubt, how to argue over meaning, and how to navigate a world where certainty was no longer guaranteed. The legacy of that struggle continues to shape the present, reminding us that culture is not something that happens in the background of history, but something that actively makes it as the 1980s approached. The cultural shifts of the previous decade began to collide with a renewed desire for confidence and control. Many Americans felt worn down by years of doubt, scandal, and instability. They did not necessarily reject the lessons of the 1970s, but they were tired of living inside them. This fatigue created an opening for new narratives, ones that promised strength, clarity, and a restoration of pride without fully returning to the innocence of the past. What made this moment distinctive was that the longing for reassurance existed alongside the habits of skepticism the 1970s had ingrained. Americans wanted leaders they could believe in, but they were less willing to grant unquestioning loyalty. They wanted economic growth, but they understood that prosperity could be uneven and fragile. They wanted national unity, but they were acutely aware of the exclusions that unity had once concealed. This tension shaped the political and cultural choices that followed. Media continued to evolve in response. News became more personality-driven, with journalists and commentators emerging as recognizable figures rather than anonymous voices. Opinion and analysis blurred with reporting, reflecting a world in which objectivity itself was under scrutiny. Audiences learned to consume information critically, comparing sources and questioning framing, even as they gravitated toward outlets that affirmed their existing views. The seeds of today's fragmented media landscape were planted during this period. The language of politics absorbed the cultural lessons of the 1970s in subtle ways. Appeals to morality, tradition, and national destiny were carefully calibrated to resonate with audiences who no longer trusted abstract authority. Symbols and stories mattered more than policy details. Political communication increasingly relied on emotional resonance, on evoking feelings of belonging or threat. This shift did not erase ideological differences, it sharpened them. Meanwhile, the personal turn that had defined much of the 1970s continued to shape everyday life. Therapy, self-help, and introspection became normalized, even mainstream. The idea that understanding oneself was a prerequisite for engaging with the world took hold across social classes. While this focus empowered many, it also reframed social problems as individual struggles, sometimes obscuring systemic causes. The balance between personal responsibility and collective action remained contested. The arts continued to grapple with these contradictions. Creators who had come of age during the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s carried their sensibilities forward, even as audiences changed. Nostalgia emerged as a powerful force, but it was rarely uncomplicated. Stories set in earlier eras often carried an undercurrent of irony or loss, acknowledging that the past being remembered was itself a construction, shaped by longing rather than accuracy. This awareness of constructed narratives became one of the most profound legacies of the Cultural Revolution. Americans learned that stories about the nation, about progress, about identity, were choices rather than inevitabilities. That realization did not tell them which stories to choose, but it made the act of choosing unavoidable. Culture became a space of constant negotiation, where meanings were proposed, challenged, revised, and reclaimed. By this point, it was clear that the changes unleashed in the 1970s were not confined to a single generation. Children raised in this atmosphere absorbed its assumptions as normal. They learned early that authority could be questioned, that identities could be fluid, and that history was open to reinterpretation. For them, the uncertainties that had unsettled their parents were simply the conditions of life. Looking back, the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s can be understood not as a rejection of American ideals, but as a confrontation with them. It forced the country to measure its promises against its realities and to reckon with the gap between the two. That reckoning was uncomfortable and incomplete, but it expanded the moral and imaginative boundaries of the nation. The decade did not resolve the tensions it exposed, and it was never meant to. Instead, it altered the terms of debate. It taught Americans to expect conflict, to live with ambiguity, and to recognize that culture is both a mirror and a tool, reflecting society even as it shapes it. The reverberations of that lesson continue to define modern America, in ways both visible and subtle, long after the noise of the era itself has faded as memory of the decade settled into history. The 1970s began to acquire a reputation that was itself revealing. It was often described as a bleak or cynical era, a time of malaise, distrust, and retreat. Yet this shorthand missed something essential. What made the period unsettling was not simply what it took away, but what it exposed. The Cultural Revolution stripped away comforting myths faster than it could replace them, leaving people to sit with questions that previous generations had avoided or suppressed. One of those questions concerned the meaning of citizenship. If the government could lie, if corporations could pollute and deceive, if media could manipulate as much as inform, then what did it actually mean to participate in a democracy? Voting alone no longer felt sufficient. Protest, watchdog journalism, community organizing, and cultural critique were increasingly seen as necessary forms of engagement. Democracy was no longer imagined as a stable structure that simply needed maintenance, but as a fragile process requiring constant pressure and attention. This realization reshaped how Americans thought about responsibility. Responsibility was no longer limited to obedience or loyalty. It included skepticism, dissent, and moral judgment. Teaching children to respect authority without question felt increasingly dangerous. Instead, many parents and educators emphasized critical thinking, encouraging young people to ask who benefits from a given rule or narrative. This approach empowered some, but it also created anxiety. Without clear moral anchors, deciding what was right or wrong became more complicated and more personal. The legal system reflected these tensions as well. Courts became arenas where cultural battles played out, from issues of free speech to privacy and bodily autonomy. Judicial decisions increasingly shaped everyday life, reinforcing the idea that culture and law were inseparable. Rights were no longer seen as abstract principles, but as lived realities that could expand or contract depending on interpretation. This legal consciousness was one of the decade's quieter but most enduring legacies. Technology, too, played a subtle role in the cultural transformation. Advances in communication and recording made it harder to hide wrongdoing and easier to circulate alternative viewpoints. Leaked documents, hidden recordings, and independent publications challenged centralized control over information. While these tools were limited compared to what would come later, they hinted at a future in which power would be increasingly contested through media itself. The emotional tone of the era deserves particular attention. The 1970s were marked by a pervasive sense of unease, but also by a stubborn resilience. People continued to create, to organize, and to imagine alternatives even when faith in grand solutions had faded. Humor became darker but sharper, capable of puncturing pretension and exposing hypocrisy. Irony served as both shield and weapon, allowing people to express doubt without surrendering entirely to despair. This emotional complexity shaped how Americans remembered the decade in retrospect. Some recalled it as a time of loss, when confidence and clarity disappeared. Others remembered it as a moment of awakening, when illusions were shattered and honesty became possible. Both perspectives contained truth. The Cultural Revolution was not a clean break with the past, but a painful transition from innocence to awareness. What makes the 1970s especially important is how deeply its questions became embedded in American life. Later debates about media bias, government surveillance, corporate power, and cultural identity all echo arguments first intensified during this period. Even when the language changes, the underlying concerns remain strikingly familiar. The distrust seeded in the 1970s did not vanish, it adapted. In this sense, the decade functions as a kind of hinge in modern history. Before it, many Americans still believed in a shared narrative strong enough to absorb conflict. After it, plurality and disagreement became permanent conditions. This shift did not doom the nation, but it did demand new skills: listening across difference, negotiating meaning, and living without guarantees. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not provide answers so much as it taught Americans how to ask better questions. It insisted that power be examined, that stories be challenged, and that comfort not be mistaken for truth. Those lessons were hard-won and unevenly applied, but they changed the country in ways that cannot be undone. And so, long after the protests ended and the scandals faded from headlines, the deeper transformation continued. It lived on in attitudes, assumptions, and habits of thought. The 1970s left America less certain, but more self-aware, less unified, but more honest about its divisions. It was a decade that forced the nation to grow up, even if it never quite decided what kind of adult it wanted to become. That unresolved adulthood shaped how Americans entered the closing years of the 20th century. The habits formed in the 1970s became the background noise of public life, so constant they were often no longer recognized as historical products. Skepticism felt natural, cultural conflict felt inevitable. The idea that every claim required interrogation became second nature, even when it led to exhaustion or paralysis. What had once been radical now felt ordinary. One of the quiet transformations of the era was how Americans related to the idea of truth. Before the cultural upheaval, truth had often been treated as something authoritative institutions discovered and delivered. By the end of the 1970s, truth was increasingly understood as contested, shaped by perspective, interest, and power. This did not mean people stopped believing in facts, but it did mean they were more alert to how facts were framed and deployed. The phrase, "who controls the narrative," began to matter in everyday conversation, not just academic circles. This shift had profound consequences for culture and politics alike. Competing versions of reality could coexist, each claiming legitimacy. Cultural products reflected this fragmentation. Stories no longer assumed a single point of view or moral center. Multiple voices, unreliable narrators, and open endings became common, training audiences to live with unresolved tension. This was not merely an artistic choice, it mirrored a society in which consensus felt increasingly out of reach. At the same time, the desire for meaning did not disappear. If anything, it intensified. People searched for coherence in smaller, more personal frameworks. Communities formed around shared identities, beliefs, and experiences rather than broad national narratives. This provided belonging, but it also reinforced division. The Cultural Revolution had expanded the range of voices, but it had not taught the country how to reconcile them. The legacy of the 1970s can also be seen in how Americans responded to future crises. When new scandals emerged, outrage was swift but rarely surprised. When institutions failed, disappointment felt familiar rather than shocking. The reflex to question authority was firmly ingrained. Yet so was the temptation to retreat into cynicism, to assume that corruption was inevitable and resistance futile. The decade had sharpened awareness, but it had also tested hope. Importantly, the Cultural Revolution did not affect all Americans in the same way. Its benefits and burdens were unevenly distributed. For some, increased freedom and visibility meant real gains in dignity and opportunity. For others, the erosion of shared norms felt like loss, disorientation, or threat. These differing experiences fueled resentment and misunderstanding, making dialogue more difficult even as the need for it grew. Looking back, it becomes clear that the 1970s were less about a single ideological shift than about a change in posture. America moved from assumption to interrogation, from confidence to caution. This posture influenced how people listened, argued, voted, and created. It shaped not just what Americans believed, but how they believed it. The decade's Cultural Revolution did not replace one orthodoxy with another. Instead, it weakened the very idea of orthodoxy. In doing so, it expanded freedom while complicating solidarity. It encouraged honesty while undermining trust. These trade-offs were never resolved, only managed, and sometimes poorly, yet there is a quiet courage in that management. To live without illusions requires resilience. To continue engaging despite doubt requires commitment. The Americans who lived through the 1970s did not simply retreat into despair. They adapted, argued, built, and imagined within the constraints they inherited. Their cultural output, their political battles, and their private lives all bore the marks of this adaptation. In the end, the cultural revolution of the 1970s reshaped modern America not by dictating answers, but by changing the rules of engagement. It taught the nation that culture is not fixed, that power must be questioned, and that identity is negotiated rather than given. These lessons continue to reverberate, shaping the present in ways both obvious and invisible, long after the decade itself has slipped into history. That ongoing reverberation can be felt most clearly in how Americans learned to live with contradiction. The 1970s trained the country to hold competing ideas at the same time, to accept that progress could coexist with injustice, that freedom could expand even as insecurity grew. This mental balancing act became a defining feature of modern American life. It made public debate more complex, but also more strained, as fewer assumptions were shared and fewer outcomes felt certain. One of the subtle shifts that followed was a change in how success was measured. The post-war ideal of steady advancement, a linear climb towards stability and comfort, lost some of its credibility. Careers became less predictable, relationships more fluid, and identities less fixed. For some, this opened space for reinvention and creativity. For others, it created a sense of perpetual instability. The Cultural Revolution had loosened structures without fully replacing them, leaving individuals to navigate uncertainty largely on their own. This reality shaped generational memory. Those who came of age during the 1970s carried its lessons into positions of influence in media, education, business, and politics. Their instincts were shaped by skepticism and self-awareness. They were less likely to accept official explanations at face value, but also less likely to believe in sweeping solutions. This sensibility influenced how institutions functioned, often making them more cautious, more defensive, and more attuned to public perception. At the same time, the decade's emphasis on exposure and critique created a paradox. By revealing so many failures and hypocrisies, it raised expectations for transparency and accountability. But when those expectations were not met, disappointment deepened. Each new revelation seemed to confirm a cycle of distrust rather than break it. The Cultural Revolution had taught Americans how to see behind the curtain, but it had not shown them what to do once they were there. This dilemma was especially evident in political participation. Voter turnout fluctuated, activism surged and receded, and public engagement became episodic rather than sustained. Moments of intense involvement were often followed by periods of withdrawal. The belief that change was possible competed constantly with the fear that systems were too entrenched to transform. This push and pull became a defining rhythm of American civic life. Culturally, the legacy of the 1970s lived on in tone as much as in content. Even when optimism resurfaced, it was often tempered by irony. Even when narratives celebrated achievement, they acknowledged cost. This sensibility made American culture more layered, but also more guarded. Sincerity became risky, easily dismissed as naivete. Irony offered protection, but it could also distance people from genuine connection. Yet the decade also left behind tools for resilience. The willingness to question authority made it harder for abuses of power to go entirely unnoticed. The expansion of voices enriched public discourse, even when it complicated consensus. The recognition that culture itself is a site of struggle empowered artists, writers, and ordinary citizens to see their expression as meaningful rather than ornamental. Over time, the 1970s came to be understood not just as a period of upheaval, but as a formative training ground. It prepared Americans for a world in which certainty would be rare and disagreement constant. It forced the nation to confront the limits of its myths and the consequences of its choices. The discomfort it produced was not a failure of the era, but evidence of its depth. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not promise comfort. It offered awareness instead. It asked Americans to look closely at themselves and their society, even when what they saw was unsettling. That invitation remains open, echoing through contemporary debates and personal reckonings alike, a reminder that culture is not something inherited intact, but something continuously made and remade under pressure. That pressure, once introduced, never fully receded. It became part of the air Americans breathed, shaping instincts even when the origins were forgotten. By the time later generations encountered debates about media manipulation, political polarization, or cultural identity, they were stepping into a landscape already shaped by the transformations of the 1970s. The ground rules had changed. Suspicion was normal. Disagreement was expected. Certainty was rare. What the decade ultimately altered was not just opinion, but temperament. Americans became more comfortable living with unresolved questions, but also more prone to fatigue. The constant need to evaluate, critique, and reassess took a toll. Engagement required effort, and disengagement became tempting. This emotional cost was one of the quieter consequences of the Cultural Revolution, less visible than protests or scandals, but just as enduring. And yet, there is something unmistakably generative in what emerged. The 1970s taught Americans that culture is not a passive inheritance handed down unchanged. It is shaped by conflict, by voices speaking back, by moments of rupture that force reconsideration. The decade insisted that democracy is not a finished project, but an ongoing argument about meaning, power, and responsibility. That argument continues, informed by the habits of mind forged during those years. Every time authority is questioned, every time a story is challenged, every time identity is asserted against expectation, the legacy of the 1970s is present, not as nostalgia, not as a single ideology, but as a way of seeing the world. The Cultural Revolution of that decade did not give America peace of mind. It gave it self-awareness. And that awareness, uneasy and incomplete, remains one of the most powerful forces shaping modern American life. Self-awareness, however, is never a stable achievement. It demands renewal, and it carries the risk of turning inward too far. One of the lingering debates born in the aftermath of the 1970s was whether the culture's intense focus on critique had weakened its capacity for collective purpose. Some observers worried that by dismantling shared myths, Americans had also dismantled the emotional glue that held society together. Others argued that those myths had been exclusionary and dishonest, and that any unity built on them was inherently fragile. This argument played out not only in politics, but in everyday life. Communities struggled to define what they owed one another. The balance between individual rights and collective responsibility became harder to articulate. When conflicts arose, they were less likely to be settled by appeal to a common narrative and more likely to fracture along ideological, cultural, or identity-based lines. The tools of critique were widely shared, but the tools of reconciliation were less developed. Still, it would be a mistake to see the post-1970s cultural landscape as purely fractured. New forms of solidarity emerged, often smaller in scale but more intentional. People gathered around shared causes, shared experiences, and shared values, even if those values were no longer assumed to be universal. These bonds could be powerful, offering meaning and support in a world that felt increasingly complex. Yet they also reinforced boundaries, creating worlds that existed side by side with limited understanding between them. The influence of the decade can also be traced in how Americans relate to failure. The collapse of trust in institutions made it harder to believe in infallibility. Mistakes, once hidden or denied, became more visible. This visibility had a dual effect. On one hand, it encouraged accountability and reform. On the other, it normalized dysfunction, making it easier to accept chronic problems as inevitable. The line between realism and resignation grew thin. Culturally, this tension fueled a fascination with imperfection. Stories centered on flawed characters, unresolved endings, and moral ambiguity continued to resonate. Audiences recognized themselves in these narratives, finding honesty in their refusal to offer easy comfort. The legacy of the 1970s lived on in this preference for complexity over certainty, for questions over answers. As time passed, the decade's upheavals were increasingly taught, discussed, and debated as history, but they never fully settled into the past. Each new generation reinterpreted them, emphasizing different lessons depending on contemporary needs. Some saw the era as a warning about excess and disorder. Others viewed it as a model of courage and confrontation. These interpretations themselves became part of the ongoing cultural conversation. What remains undeniable is that the cultural revolution of the 1970s altered how Americans understand change. Change was no longer imagined as smooth or guaranteed. It was understood as contested, risky, and incomplete. Progress could provoke backlash. Reform could create new problems even as it solved old ones. This sobering perspective did not eliminate hope, but it made hope more cautious, more conditional. In this way, the decade taught Americans to live in a state of productive tension, to care deeply while doubting fiercely, to believe in ideals while questioning their implementation, to recognize that culture is not something that stabilizes once and for all, but something that must be renegotiated with each generation. The story of the 1970s, then, is not just about protest, scandal, or artistic experimentation. It is about a shift in consciousness, a recalibration of expectations about power, truth, and identity. It is about a society learning, sometimes painfully, that certainty can be comforting but dangerous, and that freedom often arrives entwined with responsibility. That lesson continues to unfold, shaping debates that feel urgent and new, but are rooted in questions first faced with particular intensity during that decade. The Cultural Revolution did not end when the calendar turned. It became a permanent undercurrent, influencing how Americans argue, imagine, and understand themselves in an ever-changing world. That ever-changing world has continued to test the habits of mind forged during the 1970s. Each new generation inherits the tension between skepticism and hope without necessarily knowing where it came from. The instinct to question authority, to interrogate narratives, to assume complexity rather than simplicity feels natural now. But it was learned, shaped by a decade in which Americans were forced to confront how fragile their assumptions really were. One of the most enduring consequences of that period is how Americans respond to moments of apparent consensus. Unity, when it appears, is often treated cautiously, even suspiciously. The memory of how easily shared stories once masked injustice lingers beneath the surface. This has made solidarity harder to achieve, but it has also made it more honest when it does occur. Agreement must be earned, not assumed. The Cultural Revolution also changed how Americans imagine endings. Before the 1970s, there was a stronger belief in resolution, in the idea that problems could be fixed and chapters closed. The upheavals of the decade undermined that expectation. Issues were revealed as ongoing rather than temporary, structural rather than accidental. This recognition reshaped political and cultural imagination, replacing faith in final answers with an acceptance of continual struggle. That acceptance, however, is not the same as surrender. If anything, it reflects a deeper understanding of what engagement requires. The 1970s taught Americans that participation is not about reaching a state of comfort, but about remaining present through discomfort. It is about resisting the urge to simplify, even when complexity feels overwhelming. This lesson is visible in how Americans argue today. Disputes are rarely just about policy or preference. They are about meaning, identity, and interpretation. These debates can be exhausting and divisive, but they also signal a culture that takes itself seriously enough to argue about its values. The willingness to fight over meaning is itself a legacy of the Cultural Revolution, a sign that culture is understood as consequential rather than decorative. There is also a quieter legacy in how Americans tell personal stories. The confessional tone that emerged so strongly in the 1970s normalized vulnerability as a form of truth. Speaking openly about doubt, fear, and contradiction became a way of claiming authenticity. This shift reshaped literature, media, and everyday conversation, blurring the line between the personal and the political. Private experience was no longer seen as separate from public life, but as one of its foundations. Over time, this emphasis on authenticity has created its own challenges. When personal truth becomes paramount, shared standards can erode. Disagreement can feel like invalidation rather than difference. These tensions echo the unresolved debates of the 1970s, reminding us that cultural change rarely moves in a straight line. Each gain introduces new dilemmas. Each expansion of freedom requires new forms of responsibility. Still, the alternative, a return to unquestioned authority and unexamined narratives, remains largely unthinkable. The Cultural Revolution made it impossible to fully forget what was revealed. Once power had been exposed as fallible, once stories had been shown to be constructed, there was no easy way back to innocence. The nation crossed a threshold, and whatever lay on the other side would have to be navigated without the old certainties. This is perhaps the deepest significance of the 1970s. They did not destroy belief, but they transformed it. Belief became provisional, reflective, aware of its own limits. It became something held with caution rather than certainty. That shift altered how Americans relate to institutions, to one another, and to themselves. The decade asked a difficult question and never fully answered it. How do you sustain a shared life without shared illusions? How do you build trust in a world that has learned how easily trust can be broken? These questions remain open, resurfacing in new forms with each generation. What the 1970s offered was not resolution, but preparation. Preparation for a future in which disagreement would be constant, authority contested, and culture itself a site of struggle. In that sense, the Cultural Revolution was not an interruption of American history, but a lesson in how history actually works, not as a march towards certainty, but as an ongoing negotiation over meaning, power, and possibility. What comes next, then, is not an ending, but a reckoning with endurance. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did something rare in American history. It permanently altered expectations without fully resolving them. It taught people how to live inside questions rather than answers, and that skill, once learned, proved impossible to unlearn. As the decades passed, Americans carried forward a heightened sensitivity to power and language. Words mattered more than before, not just for what they said, but for what they concealed. Public statements were passed for subtext. Symbols were debated for implication. Even silence became meaningful. This attentiveness sharpened cultural awareness, but it also increased tension. When meaning feels unstable, misunderstanding becomes easier and trust harder to maintain. This instability reshaped public conflict. Disagreements that might once have been framed as policy disputes increasingly took on moral weight. If narratives shape reality, then controlling narratives feels existential. The cultural habits formed in the 1970s encouraged people to see every debate as a struggle over legitimacy itself. That perception intensified engagement, but it also raised the stakes, making compromise feel like surrender rather than negotiation. At the same time, the revolution left Americans unusually practiced at dissent. Protest, once considered extreme or unpatriotic, had been normalized as a legitimate form of participation. Even when protest waned, the idea that citizens had the right, and sometimes the obligation, to push back against authority remained embedded in the culture. This legacy complicated governance, but it also constrained abuse. Power could no longer assume invisibility. Memory played a powerful role here. The stories Americans told about the 1970s shaped how they interpreted later events. Scandals were measured against Watergate. Wars were questioned through the lens of Vietnam. Economic anxiety echoed earlier crises. The decade became a reference point, a warning, and sometimes a justification. Its lessons were invoked selectively, but they were rarely ignored. Importantly, the Cultural Revolution did not produce a single moral consensus. It produced a framework for disagreement. That framework assumed conflict was normal, that perspectives were partial, and that authority must be earned repeatedly. These assumptions became the scaffolding of modern American discourse. They did not guarantee justice or wisdom, but they changed how claims to both were received. There is a temptation to view this outcome as failure, to argue that the erosion of shared certainty weakened the nation. But that interpretation overlooks how much damage certainty once concealed. The comfort of unquestioned narratives came at the cost of exclusion, silence, and coercion. The Cultural Revolution exposed those costs, even if it could not fully repair them. What emerged was a society more honest about its fractures and less skilled at smoothing them over. Americans became better at naming injustice and worse at agreeing on remedies. They learned how to criticize institutions but struggled to imagine replacements. This imbalance created frustration, but it also preserved possibility. If no structure is sacred, then none is beyond change. The emotional inheritance of the 1970s remains mixed. Alongside cynicism lies resilience. Alongside fragmentation lies creativity. The same forces that weakened trust also expanded imagination. Artists, activists, and ordinary citizens learned to see culture as something they could shape rather than merely consume. That belief, quiet but persistent, continues to animate movements long after the decade itself. The story, then, does not move toward a clean resolution. It moves outward. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s became less an event than a condition, a way of engaging with the world that privileges awareness over comfort and inquiry over acceptance. It left Americans with fewer illusions, but also with sharper tools for confronting reality. And so the narrative continues, not toward closure, but toward continuity. The questions raised during that decade are still being asked, reframed for new contexts and new crises. Each generation answers them differently, but none escapes them entirely. The revolution did not end. It settled into the structure of American life, shaping how the nation understands itself, argues with itself, and imagines its future. That imagined future has always been shaped by memory as much as by ambition. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s taught Americans that the past is never neutral, that history itself is a contested space where meaning is constantly renegotiated. This awareness changed how the nation related to its own story. Instead of a single arc of progress, Americans came to see overlapping narratives, some triumphant, others painful, all demanding acknowledgement. This shift had consequences for national identity. Patriotism no longer rested comfortably on celebration alone. It became entangled with critique, with the insistence that loving a country meant holding it accountable. For some, this redefinition felt like betrayal. For others, it felt like maturity. The argument over what patriotism should look like, once muted, became central, and it has remained so ever since. The cultural habits formed in the 1970s also altered how Americans understand authority within their own lives. Parents, teachers, employers, and religious leaders found their roles questioned in ways that would have been rare in earlier decades. Respect was no longer automatic, it had to be justified. This democratization of authority empowered many people, especially those who had previously been expected to accept marginalization or silence. But it also generated uncertainty. Without clear hierarchies, navigating responsibility became more complex. In response, Americans developed a heightened sensitivity to authenticity. The suspicion of manipulation made sincerity a prized but fragile quality. Leaders and artists alike were judged not only by what they said, but by whether they seemed to mean it. Performative confidence was met with irony, sometimes with contempt. This hunger for the real reshaped culture, even as it proved difficult to satisfy. Authenticity, once demanded, was hard to verify and easy to counterfeit. The result was a culture perpetually alert to contradiction. This alertness sharpened moral awareness, but it also bred impatience. When every statement carries hidden implications, conversation becomes labor. When every institution is suspect, trust becomes scarce. The 1970s did not create these dilemmas, but they intensified them, embedding them in the fabric of daily life. Yet the decade also modeled endurance. Americans learned that disillusionment did not have to mean disengagement. Many continued to vote, organize, create, and argue even as faith in perfection faded. The Cultural Revolution replaced certainty with persistence. It suggested that progress, if it existed at all, would be incremental, reversible, and hard-won. This sensibility has shaped how Americans face disappointment. Failure no longer automatically signals collapse. It becomes part of a longer process of adjustment and struggle. While this can lead to complacency, it can also foster resilience. The knowledge that systems are flawed does not preclude effort, it reframes it. Change becomes less about redemption and more about repair. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s, then, can be understood as a long education in limits. Limits of power, limits of narratives, limits of certainty. But it was also an education in possibility. By revealing that the existing order was neither natural nor inevitable, it opened space for imagining alternatives, even if those alternatives remained incomplete. That tension between limit and possibility continues to define modern America. It shapes how Americans argue about justice, freedom, and belonging. It influences how they respond to crisis and how they imagine renewal. The questions raised during that decade persist, not because they were answered poorly, but because they were answered honestly enough to reveal their depth. The story has never been about returning to what came before. It has been about learning how to move forward without the comfort of illusion. That lesson, learned unevenly and imperfectly, remains one of the most consequential inheritances of the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s. That inheritance continues to shape the emotional rhythms of American life. The 1970s taught people to expect friction, to see disagreement not as a temporary disturbance, but as a permanent condition. This expectation subtly altered how Americans listen to one another. Conversations became less about persuasion and more about positioning, less about arriving at shared conclusions and more about asserting perspective. The Cultural Revolution did not invent this dynamic, but it made it visible, and visibility changed behavior. One of the paradoxes of this transformation is that while Americans became more alert to exclusion and injustice, they also became more aware of their own limits. The grand confidence that had once accompanied reform movements gave way to a humbler understanding of how difficult change could be. Progress no longer felt inevitable or permanent. Gains could be reversed. Victories could reveal new problems. This awareness tempered idealism without extinguishing it. The legacy of the 1970s can also be traced in how Americans relate to institutions they distrust but cannot escape. Government, media, corporations, and even cultural traditions are approached with a mixture of reliance and suspicion. People criticize them fiercely while continuing to depend on them. This ambivalence is not hypocrisy so much as a recognition of constraint. The Cultural Revolution made it clear that opting out entirely was rarely possible. Engagement, however flawed, remained necessary. This necessity reshaped the tone of reform. Instead of seeking total transformation, many Americans focused on incremental change, damage control, and accountability. The dream of utopia faded, replaced by a more pragmatic ethic of mitigation. This shift disappointed some who longed for sweeping change, but it also made activism more sustainable. The expectation of gradual progress allowed people to persist without the constant pressure of dramatic success. Art and storytelling continued to reflect this ethic. Narratives favored endurance over triumph, complexity over closure. Characters survived rather than conquered. Meaning was found not in resolution, but in continued effort. These stories resonated because they mirrored lived experience in a culture that no longer promised happy endings, only ongoing negotiation. Over time, the memory of the 1970s became layered with reinterpretation. It was remembered differently depending on who was speaking and why. For some, it was a cautionary tale about excess and fragmentation. For others, it was a necessary awakening. These competing memories themselves became part of the cultural inheritance, shaping how Americans argued about the present by arguing about the past. What remains striking is how deeply the decade altered emotional expectations. Hope became quieter, less declarative. Faith became conditional. Trust became provisional. These shifts did not make Americans less moral or less engaged, but they did make engagement more demanding. Caring required effort, and belief required justification. And yet, within this demanding landscape, Americans continued to imagine futures worth striving for. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not extinguish aspiration, it refined it. It stripped away the assumption that justice would arrive on its own, replacing it with the understanding that it would require vigilance, humility, and persistence. The story that emerges is not one of decline or disillusionment alone, but of adaptation. A society confronted with the limits of its myths did not collapse. It adjusted, imperfectly and unevenly, learning how to function without guarantees. That adjustment remains unfinished, and perhaps always will be. The Cultural Revolution did not solve America's contradictions. It made them visible and unavoidable. In doing so, it changed how Americans live with them, argue over them, and imagine what comes next. What comes next in that imagining is always shaped by restraint. The 1970s taught Americans to be wary of sweeping claims and final answers, and that caution settled into the culture like a permanent undertone. Big promises were met with raised eyebrows. Moral certainty invited interrogation. Even optimism learned to hedge itself, to acknowledge risk before daring to hope. This restraint changed how leadership was perceived. Charisma alone was no longer enough. Authority had to survive scrutiny, and even then, it remained conditional. Leaders were expected to explain themselves, to justify decisions, to withstand exposure. This expectation did not always lead to better outcomes, but it did change the rules of legitimacy. Power that could not tolerate questioning was increasingly seen as dangerous rather than strong. The same dynamic played out in cultural influence. Artists, writers, and public thinkers were no longer treated as unquestioned voices of truth. Their work was engaged, debated, challenged, and reinterpreted. Audiences felt entitled to push back, to reject meanings imposed from above. This participatory culture widened the field of expression, even as it made consensus elusive. Meaning became something negotiated rather than delivered. The 1970s also altered how Americans experienced time. The future no longer felt like a guaranteed improvement on the present. Planning became more tentative. Long-term faith in institutions weakened, replaced by shorter horizons and adaptive strategies. This temporal shift affected everything from politics to personal life. People learned to prepare for disruption, to expect reversals, to remain flexible in the face of uncertainty. Yet flexibility came at a cost. Without stable expectations, anxiety grew. The emotional labor required to navigate constant change became a defining feature of modern life. The Cultural Revolution had expanded awareness, but awareness itself could be heavy. Knowing more about injustice, fragility, and contradiction did not automatically produce clarity. It demanded endurance. That endurance became one of the era's quiet virtues. Americans learned how to keep going without assurance, how to invest effort without certainty of reward. This persistence rarely looked heroic. It showed up in continued participation, in stubborn engagement, in the refusal to disengage entirely even when disappointment accumulated. The revolution did not create a generation of idealists or cynics, but something more complicated and more durable. As decades passed, the language of the 1970s faded, but its logic remained. Arguments about transparency, representation, and power echoed the same concerns, even when framed differently. The questions asked then proved remarkably resilient, resurfacing whenever systems strained or trust eroded. The Cultural Revolution had not been an episode, it had been a recalibration. This recalibration reshaped how Americans understood belonging. Identity was no longer assumed to be singular or fixed. People claimed the right to define themselves across multiple dimensions, challenging categories that had once been rigid. This expansion of identity created new forms of visibility and recognition, but it also complicated social cohesion. The work of understanding one another grew more demanding, even as it became more necessary. Still, the alternative, a return to enforced simplicity, remained unappealing to most. The costs of silence and conformity had been made too clear. The Cultural Revolution ensured that even those who resisted its outcomes could not fully forget its lessons. Once revealed, complexity could not be unseen. The story, then, continues not toward closure, but toward inheritance. Each generation receives the questions shaped in the 1970s and responds to them under new conditions. Some answers repeat old patterns, others break new ground, but the underlying challenge remains the same: how to live together honestly in a society that no longer believes in easy stories. That challenge is the true legacy of the Cultural Revolution. It did not offer comfort. It offered clarity, and clarity brought responsibility. The responsibility to question, to listen, to endure disagreement without retreating into silence or force. It is an unfinished task, passed forward rather than resolved, shaping the texture of American life long after the decade itself has faded from view. That texture is felt most strongly in moments of strain, when the old reflexes resurface almost automatically. In times of crisis, Americans do not simply ask what should be done. They ask who is speaking, whose interests are being served, and what history warns them to notice. These questions, once radical, are now routine. They slow decision-making, complicate consensus, and sometimes deepen division, but they also guard against blind obedience. This reflexive questioning is one of the most enduring cultural habits born of the 1970s. It is important to recognize that this habit was not taught gently. It was forged through shock, betrayal, and disappointment. The revelations of the era did not arrive as abstract lessons, but as lived experiences that unsettled faith in leaders, experts, and institutions. That emotional memory lingered. Even as the specifics faded, the feeling remained. Trust, once broken so publicly, could never be restored to its earlier, effortless form. This altered emotional baseline reshaped how Americans handle authority in subtle ways. Compliance became conditional. Loyalty became negotiable. People learned to cooperate without surrendering judgment. This posture allowed for a more pluralistic society, but it also made unity fragile. Collective action required negotiation rather than assumption, and negotiation took time, patience, and goodwill that were not always available. The Cultural Revolution also changed how Americans relate to silence. Silence, once interpreted as agreement or respect, became suspect. Who was silent and why became a political question. Absence of speech could be read as complicity or exclusion. This heightened attention to voice expanded participation, but it also created pressure. Speaking up became both a right and an expectation, adding emotional weight to public life. Over time, this expectation contributed to a sense of constant performance. Identity, belief, and allegiance were not only held, but displayed. The self became a site of expression and interpretation, shaped by cultural currents that prized visibility and authenticity. This development can be traced back to the confessional turn of the 1970s, when private experience was first elevated as a source of public truth. Yet visibility brought vulnerability. When personal narratives carried political weight, disagreement could feel deeply personal. The line between critique and attack blurred. The Cultural Revolution had taught Americans to speak honestly, but it had not taught them how to disagree gently. That lesson remained incomplete, passed forward unresolved. Despite this, the era's influence is not simply corrosive. It also expanded moral imagination. Americans became more capable of recognizing lives, unlike their own, as meaningful. The insistence that experience mattered, that perspective shaped truth, widened empathy even as it complicated agreement. This expansion did not produce harmony, but it did produce awareness, and awareness changed what could be ignored. The 1970s also left behind a distinctive relationship to failure. When institutions faltered, the response was no longer shock alone, but analysis. Why did this happen? Who benefited? What patterns does this reveal? Failure became data rather than anomaly. This analytical posture fostered reform, but also fatigue. Constant diagnosis without resolution can drain energy and hope. Still, the alternative, denial, had lost credibility. The Cultural Revolution made clear that ignoring problems did not make them disappear. It only delayed reckoning. That lesson hardened into a kind of grim wisdom. Better to confront instability than pretend stability exists. As the years accumulated, this wisdom became interwoven with nostalgia, often in contradictory ways. Some looked back on the 1970s as a time of necessary courage, others as a moment when things fell apart. These memories were shaped less by facts than by present needs. The decade became a mirror in which later generations saw their own hopes and fears reflected. Through all of this, the core transformation endured. Americans no longer expected culture to confirm their innocence. They expected it to challenge them. Stories, art, journalism, and politics were all measured by their willingness to expose rather than reassure. Comfort became suspect. Discomfort became a sign of seriousness. This expectation continues to influence how Americans judge their society and themselves. The questions raised in the 1970s did not fade because they were never fully answered. They became permanent companions, shaping how Americans interpret power, responsibility, and belonging. The story, then, remains open. It does not move toward a neat conclusion, but toward ongoing reckoning. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not end in triumph or collapse. It settled into practice, into habit, into the quiet assumptions that govern how Americans think and argue and imagine. And it is within those assumptions that the rest of the story continues to unfold. That unfolding continues in subtle, almost invisible ways, shaping instincts rather than slogans. By the time the echoes of the 1970s became background noise, Americans were no longer consciously referencing the decade, but they were living inside its consequences. The Cultural Revolution had rewired expectations so thoroughly that even resistance to it often borrowed its language and tactics. Critique became universal, even among those who longed for certainty. One of the most profound legacies of the era lies in how Americans understand legitimacy. Authority is no longer assumed to be legitimate simply because it exists. It must explain itself, justify itself, and survive exposure. This demand has raised standards in some areas, forcing institutions to respond to pressure they once could ignore. but it has also made governance more fragile. When legitimacy is constantly contested, stability becomes harder to maintain. This fragility has emotional consequences. Living in a state of ongoing evaluation creates a sense of permanent alertness. Americans learn to scan for warning signs, for hidden agendas, for contradictions that might reveal deeper problems. This vigilance can be empowering, but it can also erode trust and peace of mind. The Cultural Revolution sharpened awareness without providing rest. At the same time, it cultivated a deep suspicion of complacency. Comfort came to be seen as dangerous, a sign that something was being overlooked. This suspicion reshaped moral language. Being unsettled became a virtue. Being challenged became evidence of growth. These values influenced education, art, and activism, reinforcing the idea that discomfort was not something to escape, but something to examine. Yet this moralization of discomfort also created pressure. If growth requires constant challenge, then rest can feel like failure. The 1970s did not intend to create exhaustion, but they normalized intensity. The expectation that individuals remain perpetually engaged, informed, and self-critical became a heavy burden. Awareness expanded faster than capacity to process it. This imbalance shaped how Americans related to hope. Hope became quieter, more guarded. It was no longer proclaimed confidently, but offered tentatively, often accompanied by caveats. Optimism learned to speak in conditional terms. This restraint protected against disappointment, but it also limited imagination. Dreaming big felt risky in a culture trained to expect disillusionment. Still, imagination did not disappear, it adapted. Instead of grand visions, Americans experimented with local solutions, personal transformations, and incremental reforms. These efforts rarely made headlines, but they accumulated quietly. The Cultural Revolution had taught people not to wait for perfect systems, but to work within imperfect ones. The influence of the 1970s is especially visible in how Americans talk about change itself. Change is no longer framed as linear or permanent. It is understood as cyclical, contested, and reversible. This realism tempers enthusiasm but deepens commitment. People who expect setbacks are less likely to be undone by them. The decade replaced innocence with endurance. Looking back, the Cultural Revolution appears less like a rupture and more like a recalibration of emotional and intellectual habits. It shifted the center of gravity from trust to scrutiny, from certainty to inquiry. This shift did not dictate outcomes, but it shaped the terrain on which outcomes were pursued. The story has never been about whether the 1970s were good or bad. It has been about what they revealed. They revealed that culture is power, that narratives matter, that silence can be complicit, that authority must answer to those it governs. These revelations altered American life at every level, from the personal to the political. And so the narrative continues, not as a march toward resolution, but as a sustained engagement with complexity. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not tell Americans who to be. It taught them how to question who they were told to be. That lesson, once learned, became irreversible. The revolution did not end with a final victory or defeat. It dissolved into practice, into the way Americans argue, doubt, create, and persist. It lives on in the habits of mind that shape modern America, quietly guiding decisions long after the decade itself has passed from living memory. That passing from living memory into inherited habit marks a crucial transition. When a cultural revolution becomes invisible, its influence is often at its strongest. The questions once argued openly now shape instinct. The skepticism once learned through shock now feels like common sense. Americans raised long after the 1970s still inherit its posture toward power, even if they no longer know its origins. This inheritance explains why so many modern debates feel simultaneously urgent and familiar. Arguments about trust, legitimacy, representation, and truth recur with striking consistency. Each generation believes it is confronting something unprecedented, yet the emotional patterns repeat. Hope rises, disappointment follows, critique intensifies, and engagement continues anyway. The rhythm established in the 1970s persists. What the decade ultimately changed was not belief itself, but the conditions under which belief is possible. To believe now requires awareness of risk. To commit requires acknowledgement of imperfection. To trust requires consent rather than assumption. These conditions make belief harder, but also more deliberate. When Americans do invest faith, whether in a movement, an idea, or a leader, it is rarely naive. It is provisional, watchful, and subject to revision. This has shaped moral courage in subtle ways. Courage is no longer defined solely by loyalty or sacrifice for a fixed cause. It is also defined by the willingness to revise one's views, to confront uncomfortable evidence, and to remain engaged even when certainty collapses. This form of courage is quieter than the heroism of earlier myths, but it is more sustainable. It reflects a culture that has learned to survive disillusionment without surrender. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s also left Americans with a deeper awareness of consequence. Actions are understood to ripple outward, to shape systems and stories beyond immediate intent. This awareness encourages responsibility, but it can also produce hesitation. When outcomes feel unpredictable, decision-making becomes heavy. The freedom to choose is paired with the fear of choosing wrongly, yet even this hesitation speaks to growth. A society that knows its choices matter is one that has moved beyond innocence. The decade forced Americans to confront the weight of their own power, individually and collectively. It dismantled the comforting belief that history simply happens, replacing it with the unsettling recognition that history is made, often clumsily, by human hands. As the long arc of the 20th century gave way to the 21st, these lessons did not fade, they adapted. New technologies, new conflicts, and new movements reframed old questions, but the underlying habits remained. Skepticism met innovation, idealism met caution, awareness met fatigue, and still, engagement persisted. The Cultural Revolution did not teach Americans how to resolve contradiction. It taught them how to live inside it. That skill, however uncomfortable, has become essential. Modern America is a product not only of its ideals, but of its reckonings. The 1970s forced one of the most profound reckonings in the nation's history, not through a single event, but through a sustained confrontation with reality. The story, then, approaches its true meaning not in conclusion, but in recognition. Recognition that culture is not decoration, but infrastructure. Recognition that doubt can be a form of care. Recognition that democracy depends not on comfort, but on participation under conditions of uncertainty. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s reshaped modern America by teaching it how to see itself more clearly, even when the reflection was painful. That clarity did not heal every wound or resolve every conflict, but it made denial harder, silence louder, and responsibility unavoidable. And it is in that ongoing responsibility, carried forward quietly from one generation to the next, that the revolution truly lives. What remains, then, is to slow the lens one final time and look carefully at what this revolution ultimately left behind. Not slogans, not victories, not a single moral lesson, but a transformed way of inhabiting the world. The 1970s altered the emotional contract Americans had with their society. It replaced expectation with attention. It replaced faith with scrutiny. It replaced innocence with responsibility. This did not happen because Americans suddenly became more cynical by nature. It happened because they were forced to reconcile ideals with evidence. When institutions failed publicly and repeatedly, when official narratives collapsed under their own contradictions, when culture itself exposed the gap between promise and reality, the country adapted. That adaptation was painful, uneven, and incomplete, but it was real. What emerged was a culture less willing to look away. The 1970s trained Americans to notice who is missing from the story, who benefits from silence, and who pays the cost of stability. This attentiveness did not guarantee justice, but it made injustice harder to ignore. It changed what could be said out loud, what could be challenged, and what could no longer pass as neutral or inevitable. At the same time, the decade imposed a permanent burden. To see clearly is to lose the comfort of simplicity. The Cultural Revolution asked Americans to live without the reassurance that someone else was in control, that systems would self-correct, that history naturally bends toward good outcomes. It replaced those comforts with something more demanding: participation under uncertainty. That demand reshaped citizenship itself. Being a citizen no longer meant merely belonging to a nation, it meant actively interpreting it. Americans were asked, implicitly and constantly, to decide what kind of country they believed they were part of and what kind they were willing to sustain. Culture became the arena where those decisions were rehearsed, argued, and revised. This is why the 1970s continue to feel present even decades later. The era did not leave behind a finished ideology, it left behind an unfinished conversation. Every debate about truth, power, identity, or responsibility carries traces of that moment when Americans collectively realized that their stories could no longer go unexamined. The revolution's deepest legacy is not distrust, but discernment, not fragmentation, but awareness of difference. Not paralysis, but endurance. Americans learned that engagement would be messy, that progress would be partial, and that certainty would be rare, and still they continued. They argued, they created, they resisted, they adapted. As this story approaches its end, it becomes clear that the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not reshape modern America by tearing it apart, nor by saving it. It reshaped America by forcing it to see itself honestly, without guarantees, without shortcuts, and without the shelter of comforting myths. What came after was not resolution, but responsibility. And that responsibility, once learned, could not be returned. Responsibility, in this sense, is not a burden that can be set down. It is a condition that must be lived with. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s placed Americans inside that condition and left them there. It did not promise that awareness would make life easier. It suggested, instead, that awareness was the price of honesty, and that honesty was non-negotiable once the veil had been lifted. What makes this moment in history so consequential is that it changed the baseline of expectation. After the 1970s, Americans could no longer assume that stability was natural, that authority was benign, or that progress was automatic. Every institution, every narrative, every claim to legitimacy carried an implicit question mark. That question mark became part of the national grammar, shaping how ideas were expressed and received. This shift did not eliminate belief. It changed the terms on which belief operated. Belief became conditional, reflective, and subject to revision. It required maintenance. This made it more fragile, but also more deliberate. When Americans committed themselves to causes, communities, or ideals, they did so with eyes open, aware of trade-offs and risks. The era replaced blind faith with conscious choice. That consciousness altered how Americans related to one another. Disagreement was no longer a sign of failure, but of engagement. Conflict became an expected feature of shared life rather than an anomaly to be suppressed. This normalization of conflict made unity harder, but it also made coercion less acceptable. Consensus, when achieved, carried more weight because it had survived challenge. The Cultural Revolution also recalibrated moral ambition. Instead of imagining a perfect society waiting just beyond the next reform, Americans learned to think in terms of ongoing effort. Justice became something pursued rather than achieved. Equality became something contested rather than declared. This reframing was sobering, but it was also clarifying. It replaced illusion with work. Over time, This ethic filtered into every layer of culture. In education, it fostered critical inquiry over rote acceptance. In art, it privileged exploration over reassurance. In politics, it encouraged skepticism toward concentrated power, even as it complicated governance. None of these changes produced easy outcomes. They produced a more demanding form of participation. The emotional cost of that demand is real. Living without guarantees requires stamina. It invites doubt, frustration, and fatigue. The 1970s did not resolve these tensions. They introduced them as permanent features of modern life. But they also demonstrated that a society could survive them. That survival, imperfect and uneven, became part of the lesson. As this story draws closer to its end, one truth stands out. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s did not change America by offering a new doctrine. It changed America by changing how Americans think about doctrine itself. It taught them to ask who wrote it, who enforces it, and who lives with its consequences. That shift continues to shape how Americans interpret power, resist manipulation, and imagine possibility. It has made the country louder, more divided, and more difficult to govern. It has also made it more self-aware, more inclusive of dissent, and more resistant to simple lies. The decade did not give America peace, it gave it perspective. And perspective, once gained, does not fade easily. Perspective changes what a nation asks of itself. After the 1970s, America could no longer rely on momentum alone. It had to choose, repeatedly, how to respond to what it knew. Knowledge, once acquired, demanded action or justification for inaction. This quiet pressure reshaped civic life. It made disengagement harder to excuse, even when engagement felt exhausting. The Cultural Revolution left Americans with fewer places to hide, but also fewer illusions to defend. It removed the comfort of pretending that contradictions were temporary glitches rather than structural realities. In doing so, it stripped away a certain kind of innocence, but it also cleared space for maturity. A mature society does not expect purity from its institutions. It demands accountability. It does not expect harmony to arise naturally. It works, imperfectly, toward coexistence. This is why the legacy of the 1970s remains so deeply embedded in modern America. The decade did not simply change opinions, it changed reflexes. It taught Americans to listen for what is not being said, to notice whose voices are absent, to ask what lies beneath reassurance. These reflexes are now so ingrained that they often feel instinctive rather than learned. The revolution's true impact can be measured not by what it resolved, but by what it made impossible. It made unquestioned authority impossible. It made comfortable silence impossible. It made the separation of culture from power impossible. Once these connections were revealed, they could not be unseen. That does not mean Americans emerged wiser in any simple sense. The Cultural Revolution did not grant moral clarity or unity. It produced friction, fragmentation, and fatigue, but it also produced vigilance. It ensured that power would face resistance, that narratives would face challenge, and that participation would be expected, even when it was difficult. In this way, the 1970s reshaped modern America not by pointing the way forward, but by removing the illusion that the way forward would ever be easy or obvious. They taught the country that democracy is not a destination, but a practice, one that demands attention, humility, and endurance. The decade's cultural upheaval did not close a chapter. It opened a permanent dialogue between ideals and reality. That dialogue continues, carried forward in debates, movements, and moments of reckoning that echo the questions first asked with such intensity during those years. The Cultural Revolution of the 1970s was not an ending. It was a turning inward, a moment when America learned to look at itself without guarantees and without shortcuts. What followed was not certainty, but responsibility. And it is that responsibility, unresolved and ongoing, that remains one of the most defining features of modern American life.